Good morning, Park High School, AP Human Geography students. We are back. We are looking at Chapter 5, Key Issues 1 and 2 on language. We're going to talk today. Our key issues are where are languages distributed and why do languages diffuse? So we start with a quick New York City sign. It has in 3 languages, Spanish, we assume Mandarin, and also English. And again, something to think about in terms of urbanization, that you're going to hear and see more languages in big cities. All right. Where are the basics? What are the basics of language? Again, we have about 7,100 languages in the world. 11 of them are major, of 100 million more speakers. Language is communication through speech, like I'm doing now, but it is often written, as I am reading right now. Not always. Many African languages did not have a written tradition, only had an oral tradition. The Hmong language would be another example that did not have a written tradition until less than 100 years ago. Right? Also note that countries may designate official languages. The United States has English as a de facto language, but it is not an official language. All right, language families with at least 7 million people, you can see throughout here, you're going to see Arabic, right? You're going to start to see not Uralic. We're going to see Congo Niger, sorry, right? You're going to see Mandarin here. You're going to see English spread throughout as well, Portuguese, Spanish, right? You see German here as well, and then you see Russian. All right, our language families, we're going to talk a lot about Indo-European families today, a little bit about Sino-Tibetan. We're going to kind of skip through the other ones just due to time and what the AP exam values. All right, there's our top 10 languages in the world. Note that Chinese is at the top and the bottom of this. And remember, Mandarin being the biggest one in the world. When you have 1.3 million Chinese, people are going to speak a lot of Chinese, right? You see Spanish and English, which are big. Again, think colonization of the Western Hemisphere for both English and Spanish as being spreaders of that. Hindi we see in India. Portuguese we see in not just Portugal, but in Brazil. Bengali we're going to see in Bangladesh. Russian we're going to see throughout what used to be the Soviet Union, but largely concentrated in Russia. You see Japanese primarily in the Japanese islands, but it is also a language of business. German you're going to see not just in Germany, but you're going to see it in Austria as well, and parts of Switzerland. All right, and if we look at our top 12, right, we look at Chinese being here where they don't break down the dialects near as much. Right? We look at one of these 12 languages. Again, we look at the difference here in terms of whether or not it is your first language or not. Last slide was that. And so we see some of the big ones here as well. We see French, the curious case of French, which is growing because of growing populations in sub-Saharan Africa, which used to be under French control when it was colonized and imperialized. So how do geographers classify religions? Right? Again, we look at centripetal and centrifugal forces. You're going to get this concept early. You're going to be using it throughout the rest of this class. A centripetal force is a force that unifies people. A common language can unify people. But keep in mind that some places that are bilingual or have multiple languages, multilinguistic countries, it can also pull people apart. And we call that a centrifugal force, like a centrifuge in science that separates a compound into their elements. Centrifugal forces divide. So places like Belgium that have 2 major division languages that divide. We could look at Canada perhaps as well. All right. Keep in mind that we have a migration factor that goes into this as well. All right. Big ticket cultural items such as language are spread through relocation diffusion, right? And then also keep in mind that interaction, right, or lack of interaction will change a language or keep a language the same if it's an isolated language. So movement of people really matters here when it comes to language. All right, so we look at an ancient idea of the spread of Austronesian languages, right, that are spread throughout Micronesia and Polynesia and Negronesia, right? But also then has that curious case of Madagascar over on the edge. All right, so when we look at some other language organizations, you see the terms institutional, developing, rigorous, threatened, and dying languages. Right, an institutional language is going to be used in education, work, mass media, and government. Right, there are about 576 institutional languages. English is going to be one of them. We look at a developing language. It's what's being used in of all ages, so children to early individuals. We look at 1600 developing language, and we look at an example of that from your book is Sama. Right? We use the term rigorous language to describe daily language by people of all ages, but lacks a literary tradition. So that's an oral, not a written tradition. That's a literary tradition. Right? And then we look at threatened languages, right? It's used for face-to-face communication, but is losing users, right? And we have endangered or threatened languages all over the world. And they use an example of one in the Philippines where there's just 56,000 speakers, right? And if a threatened language gets even worse than that, it becomes a dying language, right? Which is only used by older people and not necessarily being transmitted to children. All right. Again, how do we classify languages? We have language families. Those are broken then down into branches, which are then broken down into groups, and then you have the language itself. So there are over 100 language families, but we're going to really talk about two of them today, focus on Indo-European and Sino-Tibetan. Those are going to be our big ones, and if you look at that, that covers about 2/3 of the world. So it's going to be what we're going to be focusing on today. All right, so there's a language family. It's related through a common ancient ancestral language. Then you have a language branch, which is related through a more recent ancestral language. Keep in mind these terms, recent could mean yesterday, but it does not here, right? These languages break off and become separate. They go from being dialects of the language, of the root language, into separate languages over hundreds and hundreds of years. All right, so more recent just means it's not nearly as ancient as a language family. All right, so if we use English as an example, it is in the Indo-European family of the Germanic branch and of the West Germanic group. Right, so we see English right in here, Germanic family, and we have all of these other ones happening as we move through here, Germanic, right? And we see Dutch and Afrikaans as being, right? And our nearest relative in the West Germanic group would be Frisian, which if you ever listen to Frisian, you really can't tell. It's pretty far apart. All right, so there is our language families, right? You'll see that in the book. Right. What are other branches of Indo-European? The Indo-Iranian is going to have Hindi and Farsi, which is Persian, or think Iraq in there. Those are going to be the biggest ones. Bengali and Urdu are also going to be big. These are South Asian languages. Balto-Slavic is going to be Eastern European. You're going to have Russian as the biggest one, but also Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, Slavic, Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian. Right, all of those South group coming from the former Yugoslavia. And then we have the Romance language, which evolved from Latin when the Roman Empire devolved. These dialects of Latin became their separate languages. So Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian are going to be the big ones. You also have something called Romansh in Switzerland. You have Romanian would be a Romance language, and maybe a few others here and there. Right? Again, this led to from the fall of Rome when they stopped communicating and spreading. They took on separate enough identities to become separate languages, but they all used to be one language, and that would be Latin. All right, so again, we look at the languages of India, right? You see in here, you see Dravidian, but then you see Hindi being the big one. You see Bengali working throughout this area. Right, Indo-European languages, there's your Balto-Slavic in green, there's your Germanic in blue, your Romance in yellow. You have a few kind of shifty ones in here like Hungarian and Finnish. Those are going to be, and Estonian, these are all going to be Uralic languages. They somehow survived long enough, right? And then over here we have the Indo-European, the Indo-Iranian languages as well. All right, there's our Germanic, a little closer there, the map that you saw earlier of the families. There's your Romance languages, and you see all of the other ones, right? And we get into things like Sardinian and Sicilian and Corsican, and we start to, they are very somehow similar in ideas. And so the question is, are they a dialect? So is Sicilian a dialect of Italian, or is it its own separate language? And there could be some controversy there, right? Particularly when we start talking about Spain. And we start looking at Catalan. Is Catalan a separate language? There's some other ones in there as well. So Sino-Tibetan is going to be the Chinese language. There is no single Chinese language, but Mandarin is the largest dialect, right? And keep in mind that these thousands of characters or ideograms that go with that, right? And again, you look up here, you see Mandarin is the biggest. Right, language families of Asia. There you go. Start to see some formation here. Keep in mind that the Afro-Asiatic, right, and you have other ones in here that are Indo-European. Right, there's your Chinese ideograms. Note the differences, subtle differences, right? These are things that the English eye can't really pick up on, but they make sense if you are steeped in this language. Right. Other ones we looked at: Austro-Phoenician, Austro-Asiatic, Tai-Kadai, Japanese, and Korean. These are all separate language families. We're not going to get into them too much, though, today. All right, there's Vietnamese. Again, Vietnam was colonized first by the French, so they ended up using the Roman alphabet, which makes them a little bit unique, that you have maybe a little bit different stuff going on there. All right, what are the languages of Central and Southwest Asia? We look at Afro-Asiatic being the largest language, being Arabic, right? Altaic being Turkish, as well as some others, and they're going to be a little different in that they use the Roman, the Cyrillic, and Arabic alphabets. So there's some uniqueness there. And then you have Uralic, which the origins come from the Ural Mountains. And then we look at this as the minority language family of Europe. Europe is dominated by Indo-European. All right, so again, we start comparing languages. You can kind of look when you have English, German, and Dutch. You can see some of the things that they have in common. All right, there's the Arabic alphabet, which again looks a little different. You may have seen this in other places. All right, again, we're moving on. We move to the language families of Africa. There are 1,000 languages, right? And many lack a written tradition or a literary tradition. Why is this? This is because of the physical geography of Africa. If you think about Africa, it can be incredibly isolating. It is a very big continent, right? You saw how distorted it is on a map a lot of times. It doesn't look as big as it actually is. On many maps, you have the Sahara Desert here, which is a huge physical barrier for communication. You have dense rainforests in the central part of Africa. And then you also have very short rivers. And very short rivers then don't expand trade routes. They're tough, with the exception of the Nile River, which is fairly long, but doesn't necessarily go places. It goes through the Sahara Desert. So it is a very isolated place. And so when you don't have a a history of contact, then languages don't necessarily mix, they don't consolidate. And so you have a lot of different separate languages there, right? Three families, you got the Niger-Congo, you got the Nilo-Saharan, and you got the Khoisan, right? Which uses the clicking sounds, the tongue clicks. And the funny piece with that is that that is a Black Panther, right? The Wakandan language is Xhosa. All right, so there you go. There's your map that kind of covers all of that. Right in here, there's Wakanda. Oh wait, no, never mind. Wakanda's not real. Wish it was. It'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? All right, so there's your language families on a small scale map all over the world. Right, you've seen this before. It's in your book, so we'll move on. All right, a couple things we should look at here. AP likes to talk about this. Where did Indo-European language originate? Is there a early Proto-Indo-European? Proto means before, right? Or a very first, a prototype. Did it come from one word? And so you get linguists who break down sounds and over different languages. And there are two theories as to how this Proto-Indo-European language spread throughout the continent of Europe and into Asia as well, right? So the first one is the nomadic warrior thesis, in which or the Kurgan warrior thesis you'll hear sometimes. It's Hearth is going to be in Central Asia, somewhere in the stands of Central Asia. And then we see this being spread by Kurgan people who were warring, right? And they would go and conquer places, and they would bring their language with them, and that would be how it diffused. The second theory is the sedentary farmer thesis, and that Hearth is going to be on the Anatolian Peninsula, which is now modern-day Turkey. And that idea is that the Proto-Indo-European language was spread through seeds and crops and trade and ideas. The diffusion of good agricultural ideas were spread, were what spread the language, right, from the sedentary farmer thesis. So those are the two. Know the difference between the two. All right, language formation, right? We start looking at how we practice this, and there's professions out there, linguists. They look at similarities. They look at sound shifts, slight changes in words. For example, milk in Romance language is lacte in Latin, but then becomes lata or lat or leat or leche in Spanish. So you see the common pieces, right? Slight changes in words and sound shifts. We also look at Jacob Grimm from the Grimm brothers. He had a theory. He said that continents become softer over time. Right. So, for example, the German Vater becomes the Dutch Vader, which becomes the English for father. Right, and the sound shifts become much less harsh over time. Right, they become softer over time. Right, and so there's a little bit of foreshadowing in the Star Wars series. Right, that Darth Vader is named in the German name for father. Dun dun dun. All right, so there's your nomadic warrior thesis, the Kurgan Hearth, right there through Central Asia, spreads to the other Indo-European places where Indo-European languages are spoken through the sword. Right? And there's the sedentary farmer thesis, where it was spread through the seed and agricultural practices. And there's your Anatolian Hearth, sedentary farmer thesis. Right, so on to English. How did English originate, right? English is a messed up language if you think about it, right? And it comes from the island of the British Isles, right? So we'll start with England, right? And England was originally inhabited by a group called the Celts, and they had a language. They had Celtic languages. There's Gaelic and some other ones, different types there. They are all Celtic languages. So you see a series of invasions that go on, and every invasion that comes through Britain changes the language patterns there. So modern English has evolved from early languages of early Germanic groups, right? The Anglos, the Jutes, and the Saxons. The Germanic invasions go and they take and you see a mixing with Celtic, and so you have a Proto-English language or an earlier English language, Old English, is a reflection of those two language groups meeting, right? And then we have a Northern Germanic influence when the Vikings invade, and they don't stick. They don't stay in the British Isles for very long, but they do mess around for a couple hundred years, and that has a linguistic change happening because of that. And then in 1066, we have the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion, right? And William the Conqueror coming in, and the Norman invasion brings French, right? So you're going to see a third or fourth overlapping language that influences today's English. And so English, if you think about it, is a very difficult language to learn because it has a lot of different influences, and not every rule follows the same patterns that it should, right? And so it is a very difficult language to learn because it has so many different influences. Right, so we look at the invasion of England right in here, right? There's your 5th century coming. You have Celtic as a base, right? You have the Anglos, Jutes, and Saxons coming from these areas. You have the Northern Germanic coming from the Vikings, right? Then you have the Norman invasion right in here. All right, so how is it diffused, right? It's the official language in 57 countries, but not the United States. It's the first language of over 300 million, spoken fluently by over 1 billion people in the world. It is a very big and important language, right? How does it get spread? British imperialism is the best answer to that. Keep in mind that the American colonies are directly influenced by British imperialism because we used to be part of England at that point. The English also spread the English language to Ireland, South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, modern day India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, Africa, on the bottom of Africa in particular, South Africa and around in there, and then Australia and New Zealand. Okay, not the only people who spread English, because the U.S. then spreads it to the Philippines. We don't like to think of ourselves as colonizers, but we did colonize the Philippines and made that a language in there, and Puerto Rico as well. Right, so English as a predominant language or an official language, you can see it is widespread throughout the world. Right, which leads us to a lingua franca, which is a language used by speakers of different languages to communicate. English is going to be the world's biggest lingua franca at this point. Right, it's used in global trade. It's used in air communications. Can you imagine if a pilot cannot speak English, but the air control tower can? That's going to be trouble. So everybody has to speak English. It's used on the internet quite a bit as well, although not exclusively. Right? We also see other lingua francas in East Africa, Swahili in East Africa. We see Hindi throughout South Asia. There's many different languages in South Asia, but Hindi is one that overlaps many. So people will generally, if you're in South Asia, you speak your local language, you speak Hindi, right? And then there's also a tradition, remember, of English there as well through British imperialism, right? Russia in the former USSR. We also see ASL, right, as a lingua franca for the deaf and hard of hearing, right? But remember, English is the most dominant lingua franca in the world. Many countries teach English as a second language. It happens, right? Right, and for example, in the European Union, 90% of European Union students learn English. Right, so there's our lingua francas. Again, you see Arabic throughout the Muslim world. Right, you're looking at Spanish throughout Latin America. You see English throughout much of the world. And here, right, you have Chinese, probably Mandarin Chinese. You got Russia in here as well. Right, Portuguese in Brazil. Right, that people might speak a local tribal language, but they also speak Portuguese. All right, what do we think the next lingua franca is going to be? Well, some people say that it is going to be Chinese. All right. And it's again written in logograms rather than sounds, so the symbols that represent words or parts of words. Right. It's become attractive to use in social media, right? Because social media restricts characters, right? That you only get, you only have to use half as many characters for messages. So that's something to think about in terms of um, looking at this in here, right? English is a quarter, right? But Chinese is 20% the language of internet users, and we look around Spanish. Surprisingly, only clocks in at about 8. Right? So we look at mother tongue speakers, and we look at English, right? And lingua franca speakers. English is the biggest language in the world if you add all the people who can speak English, but it's not their first language. Whereas Mandarin might be our second lingua franca here if we look at terms, right? Arabic would be a big one, as well as is Malay in Malaysia. And there you have it.